report to the command. So that's why it's going to save on my cloud, and then afterwards, then I will forward it to Canada to all of the hide that here. If you're not able to see it, and then you do your slide, page your slide. Huh?
Yes.
Just a backup recording.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wendell Nokia, and I will be the moderator of the seminar, which Prof. Don is the presenter for the seminar. We are honored and privileged for you to be here and to come and discuss this very important topic with us on ECOWAS and the legality of military intervention to reverse the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Niger and beyond. Just briefly, the program. So I will, in a minute, just introduce the Dean, or the Dean will have a few minutes to give your opening remarks. Then you will have a presentation by Professor E, and then you'll have a few closing remarks by Dr. So just briefly, from my side, I just want to read out this quote by President Mohamed Bazoum of Niger. Before I hand over to the Dean, he wrote a piece which he sent to the Washington Post on the 3rd of August 2023, and he said the following: I write this as a hostage. Niger is under attack from a military that is trying to overthrow our democracy, and I'm just one of hundreds of citizens who have been arbitrarily and illegally imprisoned. This coup, launched against my government by a faction in the military on July 26, has no jurisdiction whatsoever. If it succeeds, it will have devastating consequences for our country, our region, and the entire world. Thank you, Prof. De Wil, for a few opening remarks.
Yeah, seems to be working. So yes, so just a few words from my side. I see we have about 20 people online and more than 10 people here. So great of all of you to join us for this seminar. As Wendell pointed out, it's a very important topic that Professor Ije will be talking to us about, affecting not only Niger but West Africa, and also in a sense the whole world, because it is democracy that is at stake here, and we know that more and more in the world, with all the dictators that we have nowadays, that democracy is under threat. So it's a very important topic to deal with. And Professor Ije, everybody knows, he is our director of the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice. He will soon have fantastic offices that he will be moving into, and we invite all of you to go visit him there when you come to campus again, hopefully within the next month or so. That will be done. But with all that, over to you, John Mark, and we look forward to the presentation.
No, that's fine. You can suggest it. Pick up your sound.
Yes. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all for taking time off your busy schedule to join us in our discussion of this important topic, as highlighted by our moderator and the Dean. What I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is to try and try and lay out in sort of broad strokes what the legal aspect of this topic entails. Of course, there is the political aspect, which I think is more known, we're more conversant with that political aspect. As events unfold, we hear of the developments in the media, but there's a legal background to the events that are unfolding, or legal requirements that we should also be aware of. So that is part of the reason behind this presentation. Another reason is to perhaps get us to start thinking, not only has academics and researchers who engage in research, but has part of UWC's scholarship of engagement to think around how our research connects to the everyday realities of our communities or country. So what I'll do is to look at the regional and sub-regional context in which the Niger coup is evolving. So I'll begin by showing you this brief geography of the region, so you can then get a sense of the effect of some of the responses to the coup. As you can see, Niger is a landlocked country. It's bordered by Nigeria, Mali, Chad, Algeria, and Libya and Burkina Faso. the West African region is not new to instability. And for very many years, it's been one of the most unstable regions in the whole of Africa. And there is a history to that instability. That history, of course, has most things in Africa has to do with colonization and its legacy. So I've titled this subheading as the Cold War crossfire. In many parts of Africa, the countries were caught in armed conflict immediately after independence, whether it's Sudan you're looking at, or whether it's Ghana, where the first coup in Africa occurred, or whether it's Nigeria, which followed with a coup in 1966, January and June. And so this, of course, that led to the Nigerian Civil War. From the east to the north, from west to south, Central Africa, the dream of freedom and prosperity and development that Africans had envisaged, that the formal end of colonization would bring, did not immediately materialize. And there are many reasons for that, which I will not go into, but perhaps we would have time to talk about those during the question and answer session. So one of those reasons was the Cold War that was at its height during the decolonization process in the 1960s, and when most African countries gained independence. So very conscious of the global environment in which they operated, most of these African countries began to group themselves into different kinds of regional blocs. And ECOWAS was one of those blocs that was established in 1975. And that, if you look at the provisions of the nature of the treaties that ECOWAS adopted, and the views that were reflected in the treaty showed much concern with socioeconomic development. So the focus was very much on socioeconomic development as far as the sub-region is concerned. On the second part was, because of that global context, the very acute awareness of possible aggression from the two major global blocs, which is the East and the West, and the US-led West and the Soviet-led East. So you see, apart from the Treaty of the Economic Community of West African States that was adopted on 28 May 1975, there was also the ECOWAS Protocol on non-aggression. Now, the idea behind that non-aggression, of course, in that context of Cold War, that and members would rally around each other to safeguard the hard-won political independence. There was also the protocol relating to mutual assistance on defense, adopted on 29 May 1981. All of these sort of had that Cold War mentality behind the treaties, and not just only in the region, of course, beyond. Now, we then move on, as you know, fast forward to 1989, when the Cold War was nearing its end in 1990. The events around those 5 years, from 1989 to 1994, which of course in some way also resonate here in South Africa, major shifts were taking place in the world. And ECOWAS also was not left out. There were two, as I would point out in my presentation, there were two major incidents. The first being the Liberian Civil War that broke out in 1989. So the legal framework and the focus of ECOWAS also began to shift. First, from just focusing as a regional economic bloc on socioeconomic development, it began to move towards more security, a peace and security kind of arrangement. It began to shift, not only in political terms, but also in legal terms. So with the war in Liberia starting in 1989, ECOWAS realized that it was not enough to just be an economic development bloc. It started to take seriously the issue of peace and security. So it had to go back to its 1975 constitutive document, which is the treaty, and revise it to speak to the realities that were unfolding in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s. So, and the new treaty that was adopted was the revised treaty adopted on the 24th July 1993. And if you look at Article 58 of that treaty, I've highlighted the specific aspect that deal with or speak to peace and security. Article 4E, Article 4G, Article 58E, 8F, all speak to the need to maintain peace and security in the West African region. Now, from then on, ECOWAS became more or less known for its peace and security innovative treaty provisions. From this particular revised treaty, it followed with the ECOWAS mechanism, protocol on the mechanism for the establishment of a peace and security framework. Now, the civil war in Liberia and the military coup in Sierra Leone caught ECOWAS unaware, because the 1975 treaty did not have any such provision for peace and security and how it should deal with it. When it adopted the 1993 revised treaty, this provision began to filter in to try and create a peace and security architecture, legal architecture, with which it can respond to the new challenges that it was facing. First, from the Liberian Civil War, ECOWAS had to act in an ad hoc manner by setting up the ECOWAS monitoring group in order to intervene and restore peace. But that is not our focus. Our focus here is the particular instances in which ECOWAS had to take military force as a way to respond to unconstitutional change of government. And the first was the incident of Sierra Leone in March 1997. From 1991 to 1997, Sierra Leone had been caught in its own civil war. But it was the military coup that was led by John Paul Kuruman that led ECOWAS, which was then led by the chairman was Major General Sani Abacha, president of Nigeria, as it were, who then led that intervention to restore the democratically elected government of Amen Tajan Kaba that was overthrown by the army. Now, that was the first time ECOWAS would take military action to intervene and reverse the overthrow of a democratically elected government. In a broader context, given all the shifts that were happening around the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union and more or less the enthronement of, if you like, liberal democracy, has the new, of course, we would all agree, concept that the world had come to embrace. They emerged the idea that democracy was perhaps a right that should be defended, and if needs be, by use of military force. So as you will see in subsequent ECOWAS protocols, that provision was included in one of its protocols. Perhaps another point I should also mention is the fact that if you look at the legal requirement, what was ECOWAS use of force in Liberia, for example, or in Sierra Leone, whether to stop a civil war or to reverse the overthrow of a democratically elected government, was it legal? At the time there was no precedent, so to speak, that a regional organization would intervene in one of its member states, militarily so, and reverse the overthrow of a democratically elected government without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Of course, we know that Article 53 of the UN Charter is very clear on that a regional organization cannot undertake the use of force without the prior authorization of the UN Security Council. But in Liberia, ECOWAS did not apply for UN Security Council authorization. In Sierra Leone, it did not apply for authorization. And as it turned out, in both cases, one to stop a civil war, the other to reverse the overthrow of a democratic government. The UN Security Council did not condemn ECOWAS action as illegal. There could be various explanations, but the general view is that, well, it was a good deed because it was calculated to halt humanitarian crisis that was unfolding in both countries. It still remains a question today as to the legality of the ECOWAS intervention. But the point to take from here is that from then on, ECOWAS then made a provision in its protocol that empowers it to intervene militarily if there is any coup in a member state. How does that sit with the particular provision in the charter that I just referred to has never been resolved? And subsequent legal development in the continent, especially the adoption of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, how this particular provision sits with those of the African Union and of the UN itself have never been resolved. And we see them playing out in how the AU and how the UN has responded to the Niger crisis. So the relevant part of the mechanism for conflict prevention and management and resolution, peace and security, and that was adopted in Togo is Article 10, Article 22, Article 25, Article 26. But here is the provision of Article 10. It establishes the Mediation and Security Council and gives it the power to decide on all matters relating to peace and security, and also the power to decide and implement all policies for conflict prevention, management, and resolution, peacekeeping, and security, and to authorize all forms of intervention, and to decide particularly on the deployment of political and military missions. So we've been, if we follow, when we get to Niger, the coup in Niger, I'll talk more about this. We've been following the discussion without reference to the UN Security Council specifically in relation to the authorization or mandating any standby force that is going to undertake the intervention that ECOWAS is pledging. And that again raises an interesting point, and even more so because this time the UN Security Council has not expressed its opinion regarding such intervention. In no too distant past, especially in the case of Gambia, and the UN Security Council, or rather members individually had expressed the view that if ECOWAS intend to use force, as they had threatened in 2016 in the case of Gambia, that it should seek a UN Security Council authorization. But in this case, the UN Security Council has been more or less silent in the case of Niger. And we'll talk more about that, or why I think that is so in the case of Niger. Now, Article 22 of the mechanism provides for the enforcement of, among other things, the enforcement of sanctions. ECOWAS has imposed sanctions on Niger. So prior to this time, ECOWAS had its ECOMOG, which was the military wing, or rather is the military wing of the regional bloc. So one of its functions is to enforce sanctions, including embargo, prevent, also engage in preventive deployment, peace building, disarmament and demobilization, and policing activities, including the control of fraud and organized crime. So whether ECOWAS would seek UN Security Council authorization if it's going to, for example, in this particular context where Burkina Faso and Mali are sending humanitarian aid and sending supplies to Niger in violation of ECOWAS position. If ECOWAS decide to deploy its standby force to enforce the sanctions and embargo it has imposed on Niger without seeking UN Security Council authorization, again, there are legal concerns about the validity or legal validity of such action. And more crucially is Article 25, which speaks directly to the Niger case. Amongst other provisions of the protocol, Article 25 provides that this particular mechanism will be invoked in the event of an overthrow or attempted overthrow of a democratically elected government. So in terms of ECOWAS law, it's clear there is a provision that enables ECOWAS to militarily intervene in any of its member country when there is an overthrow of a democratically elected government. The issue, as we will see, is not that simple or straightforward when it comes to the implementation of that particular provision. For very many reasons, the first, the AU is opposed to the use of military force in Niger, and the UN Security Council has not authorized the use of force in Niger. So again, even though ECOWAS has the military, well, you might say the military muscle and the legal basis to act, questionably so in the absence of UN Security Council authorization, it's hard to imagine that it can actually launch such military intervention against the will of the African Union and perhaps without authorization from the UN Security Council. So there is another regional dynamic that is at play, which we have not seen, or maybe we have seen in past cases, but not very pronounced. And that regional dimension is the response by the ECOWAS states. We'll see of course, the regional countries that I pointed out earlier on includes Mali and Burkina Faso, and these are neighbors of Niger as well. Unlike in the past, when ECOWAS managed to, even if not general consensus, but managed to have a broad acceptance of its intervention. In this case, it is the bloc is almost polarized and top down, with many countries, or rather some countries, siding with the junta and others siding with ECOWAS. Traditionally, the the division within ECOWAS had been along the lines of the colonial masters, whether they were colonized by Britain or colonized by France. Those that were colonized by France, the Francophone country, were more or less opposed to past interventions. It took much consensus building and efforts of collaboration to bring them on board to get a consensus for such intervention. In this case, it is even more so in the sense that rather than having the Francophone countries on one side and Anglophone countries, Nigeria, Ghana, and the others on the other side, it is very different. You have Senegal, for example, a Francophone country supporting the intervention. You have Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, who are also opposed to the intervention. So what that creates is an ECOWAS that is divided, and it remains to be seen how such divided house would be able to not just launch, but sustain a military intervention such as the one that is contemplated to restore the democratically elected government. Now, to further complicate the matter beyond the requirement of legality is the question of what we understand by coup. If we go by the definition of what a coup is, ECOWAS in its own in its own legal instrument refers to it as undemocratically elected government accessing power through unconstitutional means. In its charter on democracy and good governance, it's strictly provided, explicitly provided in Article 1 that you shall only access power through free and fair elections. So it's clear to access power through some other means would amount to unconstitutional change of government. The interesting dynamic is in the Niger case is this. When we try to gauge the legitimacy of government, we usually proceed on the basis of how people respond or how the citizens of that country respond or view the basis upon which such government exercise authority. And in a sociological sense now, the basis upon which such government exercise authority has acceptable to them or not, apart from the way it came to power, or whether or not the basis upon which such power is exercised or sustained is one that the people respect as valid. So my question is, if we look at how we have categorized this kind of incident in other parts of the continent, take Libya, take Egypt, and all those countries that experienced the Arab Spring, and the basis upon which the regimes were overthrown, they were often characterized as legitimate popular demand. So the regime of Hosni Mubarak had lost legitimacy because Egyptians no longer had faith in him and he had to step down. Muammar Gaddafi had lost popular, the popular support of his people, therefore he had lost legitimacy and he had to step down. Then let's flip the coin and see in Niger, can we say that the massive turnout of people in jubilation in response to the coup on July 26 is an indication of, or can it be interpreted as an indication of legitimacy of the regime that came to power through such coup? Well, I don't have an answer to that, but I guess we can talk more about it during question and answer session. And the second question I also want to pose to us in this case is, this morning I just heard that there has been a coup in Gabon. So if there's been a coup in Gabon, now in Mali, in Burkina Faso, so obviously it's spreading. Yeah, so my question then is, how should we respond as scholars to this kind of conundrum? On the one hand, there is no doubt that this particular junta has violated the ECOWAS Charter on democracy and good governance. It has violated the African Union Constitutive Act that provides that there shall be no unconstitutional change of government, and just name it. However, it seems to enjoy popular support. So how do we then categorize or rather respond to such conundrum in which a government that is to all intents and purposes illegal enjoys such massive popular support? I pointed out earlier that there seems to be a shift in regional response between the Anglophone and Francophone countries, and also the UN Security Council has more or less been quiet, and we have to grapple with the issue of what a coup is. The French were very quick to denounce it as a coup, but the US has been reluctant to use the word coup to describe what happened in Niger. And we can see this in a broader context of US-French relations and how it impacts Niger. And the US has a base in Niger. Niger is the French, one of its largest supplier of uranium. So there are very many reasons why Niger is important and why the coup in Niger seems to be more highly debated than what we saw in Mali and what we saw in Burkina Faso. And the divergence of the interest of global actors, I think, is what explains that. Because every time you turn on whether it's in the newspaper or the television, or you get to hear something about the coup in Niger. And my own reflection is that at the end of the day, Niger will still remain the second poorest country in the world, as it is, and that the reason it's so debated today is because of the presence, or rather the interest, the national self-interest of the external actors. So we then ask ourselves, when does the defense of democracy, like ECOWAS is angling to do, and the French are supporting the intervention, very, very unusual, because the French had never supported ECOWAS intervention, whether it was in Côte d'Ivoire or in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, because of the traditional rivalry between the Anglophone countries, more or less still led by France, and the the Francophone countries, and then Nigeria leading the Anglophone countries in West Africa. So we then see that beyond touting the need to defend democracy, when national self-interest is at stake, my own argument is that democracy gives way. And my reason for coming to that conclusion is the instances of intervention when democratic governments have led or instigated coups to overthrow democratic governments in other countries around the world. That's one instance. And another is this particular one that we are dealing with, that we can label a military intervention, we can label a military coup a coup if it provides the legal basis for the subsequent for the action that we contemplate to take subsequently. In other words, once a particular military action is labeled a coup, it sets in motion a series of other legal processes, domestically and internationally, which then validates or justifies or is supposed to justify the action that we then choose to take as a country. But my argument is that underlying any such categorization is the national interest of every state that is involved. And there is hardly any such thing as an intervention that is devoid of national self-interest. So even those countries within ECOWAS that are pushing for the intervention, like Nigeria and others, have something at stake to be safeguarded or to gain from this particular intervention. We have a coup in Gabon, and there are other issues that also intertwine with this particular topic in Niger, which time will not allow me to go into. But of particular note is the globalization of terror in the whole of the Sahel region. I call it globalization of terror in that Sahel region because from the small insurgent groups that had been operating in that region in less than a decade ago, today we have almost the entire Sahel countries have terrorist groups operating in them. And at the same time, we have troops, whether it's MINUSMA in Mali, and the French troops that were stationed in Niger, they've been in Burkina Faso, they've been in Mali before this time. We have all of these supposedly counter-terrorism operations. But how come we are having increasing activities by terrorist organizations? So much so that there is now a push further down the sub-Saharan part, below the Sahel region. So it's a sort of puzzle. How can you have more policemen and more criminals? Something is not right. So in the context of the coups that just happened in Gabon and the other coups that spreading all over Africa now, especially in that west of Africa, we see my own reflection is that we tend to believe in the ideals that we want aspire to. We want the ideals to be implemented, we want them operationalized, to live them. But we also have to live in the reality. And one of such realities I've continued to argue is that it is the bullet instead of the ballot that secures democracy. That the African Union, ECOWAS, for the last 20 years or for the last 30 years, I beg your pardon, since that so-called third wave of democracy, they've been trying to institutionalize democratic ethos in member countries. But it has not worked. And my take is that the reason it has not worked is twofold. The first is socio-economic development. The second is the failure of attempt to professionalize the army. Now, both of them are linked. And I can tell you the reason you see people jubilating in the street of Niamey, celebrating the coup, which they should be condemning, is very likely as a result of hunger. And the explanation is simple. If you give a ballot paper and bread to a youth from West Africa who is willing to cross the Sahara Desert and try to cross the Mediterranean Sea, or rather die trying, if you ask him to choose between a ballot and bread, he would choose bread. So I think it's mere fantasy to begin to try to believe that we can actually sort of establish democracy in these countries without dealing at the same time economic issues, especially the issue of poverty. In that particular region, the issue of insecurity and climate change, socioeconomic conditions of the people, and the resurgence of military coup, they are interconnected. And so any attempt to deal with one must adopt a comprehensive or a holistic approach that addresses all of these various components or dimensions of the problem. Otherwise, I'm more than certain that we will have more coup in West Africa. Thank you, and I think I'll be obliged to take questions and comments. Did I do with time? Excellent. Yeah, we started with that. Just 30 on the phone.
Yeah, it's perfect. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have the question and answer session now. So if you are online, you are welcome to post your comments or questions there. I know we have one or two comments already. And let me start with those before I go to the floor. I'm sure there will be a few questions. So it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Prof. E. And you asked us a lot of questions. So hopefully we can also deliberate with you or come up with solutions. So the first comment was made by Habib here online, and he said, military action as an option should not be resorted to, considering the humanitarian crisis that could aggravate. Now, Niger Republic is already battling with hunger and poverty, something that you did mention. ECOWAS should be used to satisfy other hidden interests. He's definitely referring to something there, other than what you discussed. Habib, you can also, if you want to, comment on that or post a further comment if you want to. You can just raise your hand in the chat. And then we do have a question here from Jane Shambare. What kind of intervention can ECOWAS make in the recent Gabon coup? The coup seems justified considering the unfair elections. The military has claimed to nullify the elections and put Ali Bongo under house arrest. To me, this hits close to home with the recent election in Zimbabwe. I'm asking what kind of intervention is needed in order to protect democracy. When there are clear democratic violations, such as seen in Zimbabwe elections, what can be done to protect public interest? Those are the two questions. Do you want to comment on those? Do you want to take another?
Okay, let me just respond to this.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Abib. And we will get to the floor now. I'm sure there are some people who want to ask a few questions.
I guess Habib's was more or less comments. Possibly, like I perhaps also suspect ECOWAS may be serving more than just altruistic motives. To Jane's question, Ali Bongo, they've established a political dynasty in the country, in Gabon. They've been in power, father to son kind of succession, for about 56 years. And now this is the third term, the third election being won by Bongo. How should ECOWAS, well, Gabon is in Central Africa, so obviously it doesn't fall within the ambit of ECOWAS to respond. But in the context of our general discussion or conversation about the resurgence of military coup, somebody said there is no democracy. The democracy index shows that in Africa, perhaps with the exception of South Africa and Botswana to some extent, who score relatively well in the democracy index. And the others, the vast majority, whether it's Nigeria, Gabon, or Cameroon, they're flawed democracy. Some are grouped as hybrid democracy, in which case they combine both democratic and authoritarian tendencies or practices. They are neither democracy just because of the mere fact that they have periodic elections. That is not enough to make a country a democracy, right? And the Gabon is one good example of that kind of flawed democracy, in the sense that in the democratic indices or indicators, it will not measure up to the criteria that you require for it to be classified as a democracy. The fact that it has or it holds periodic elections, that is all. Beyond that, the election is a farce. It's a charade. And in Zimbabwe, well, I guess that story is known to everybody. So its past elections have been less than I would say transparent, been questionable verdict, voter intimidation, ballot stuffing, and what have you. So yes, so how should ECOWAS? I think the response should actually be directed to, or rather should come from the African Union. Unfortunately, the African Union does not have the kind of muscle that ECOWAS has for very many reasons. Finance, I mean, it's easy. The number is smaller in ECOWAS, and you have people who are willing to take the lead. In African Union is more difficult, because this time you're going to have South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and there are no guarantees that all these so-called big five will agree that we need to do something about Gabon. It's only when you have such agreement that something can happen. But in ECOWAS, it's different, and because, of course, Ghana and Nigeria can easily, Cote d'Ivoire can come to a consensus as the major big players in the region and try to mobilize the others and Senegal to do something about it. But in Africa, in Gabon, it's different. Of course, we don't even want to talk about the economic community of Central African states. and they've not been able to deal with Cameroon and the ambassador crisis, let alone Gabon. So I'm afraid that's the military junta will stay, except France does something, but which is very unlikely because of the anti-French sentiment that is growing across the continent. I don't think any colonial master or past colonial master would want to take chances.
Thank you, Prof. So from the floor, I see we have 3 questions online, but from the floor, any questions for Prof. Lee or comments? Question at the back. Please introduce yourself. Hopefully, the online audience can also hear you.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. So you spoke about intervention having an national self-control. So
Sorry?
National self-interest.
Okay.
intervention having an national self-control. So I try to register for other for a system and I give no intention of benefiting some people. So as we know in Niger, we have the French troops, we had absolutely having plans to retreat and take the troops out of would you say that having the military presence of the French troops would be France protecting their own self-interest of the government, where the Iranian which and then we were talking about the pledge of democracy and how the Western states, Western capital states are failing for democracy. I'd like to know whether is there one standard form of democracy? Are we expected to abide to maybe a form of democracy following the or Americans or country of created our own into the dictator of our history and our way of government. I think that's the issue.
One more from the floor. We have to finish at about 3:30. It's about 50 minutes.
Thank you. I just have one question. In the context of African states, what do you think is the role of the military? Because we're told that the state has 3 branches, the judiciary, executive, then the legislature, but in many African states with power, effectively developing states with power that the military always plays important role. So what do you think is what's their mandate? Do they just secure the borders, or do they have a mandate to also ensure democracy and other interests within the society?
Thank you, Prof. If you want to reply to that.
Okay, thank you. Well, intervention and yes, it is a difficult question that academics have wrestled with. How do you determine whether or not a country that is planning military intervention is going there for national self-interest or is actually intervening to protect values that are considered to be fundamental to the international community? Well, for over the last 200-300 years, and there are perhaps very few cases that can be regarded as wholly altruistic humanitarian intervention. In almost every case, in fact, in some cases, it is argued that there should be national self-interest. The reason those who argue for the presence of national interest is because they claim that if there is no national self-interest involved, the country that is going to undertake the intervention may not have any incentive to sustain such intervention, because it's going to cost you money, it's going to cost the lives of your soldiers, it's going to have all sorts of implications. So there must be something for you to gain. There must be something at stake for you, rather than just talking about general insecurity or instability in the region. They say, no, that is not enough. There must be some national, but I don't share that view. I think it's possible to have a wholly humanitarian intervention that is devoid of national self-interest. In terms of the sovereignty of Niger and the presence of French troops, I think already the presence of foreign military troops in the territory of a sovereign nation state is only valid in law, or rather is only valid in international law if it was based on the consent of the territorial state. In other words, if the French troops were stationed in Niger, usually there will be what we call status of force agreement, so far. Now, if the SOFA says that the French troops can stay here, an agreement between Niger, of course, there was one between Niger and France, then the French troops can be there. But from what we know in the case of Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda, the ICJ ruled that the moment the DRC government terminated that state of force agreement and asked the Ugandan troops to leave, the Ugandan troops was in violation of its international obligations by continuing to maintain its troops in the territory of the DRC. So I think it was 2 weeks ago that 2 or 3 weeks ago now that Niger terminated the military agreement between it and France. So if the French troops remain in Niger, they remain there in violation of international law. That is settled as far as the ICJ judgment on the Uganda case is concerned. And that only happens in real terms because of weak states that are weak. It's unusual for you to find maybe South African troops stationed in Russia. Doing what? Providing security. It's not possible. You can only have Russian troops stationed here, right? Realistically now, I mean, Turkey, you can only have American troops stationed in Niger, French troops stationed in Mali. You can have Nigerian troops stationed in France also. It's about power equation and balance of power. So if there is no such balance of power or equation, then the weak states will suffer. Is there a form of democracy? Is there a model democracy that we should all subscribe to? Well, I think the most popular model that is held up is Western liberal democracy. What does that mean? That means a written constitution, free elections, free press, this, that, and all of those things. That's what it entails. But should Africa, or can African states replicate such model? If you ask me, my answer is, I very much doubt. I'll tell you why. The answer would surprise you. You know why? We are so used to being ruled by kings, right? Mahmoud Mamdani, when you look at the difference between citizens, when you are in a Republican state like South Africa, right? You are a citizen. You can aspire, at least notionally, aspire to any office in the land, right? But when you are in a kingdom, you are a subject of the king or of the queen. Everything you do is at the pleasure of the king or the queen. You can't aspire to become the queen if you are not from, or aspire to become the king if you are not in line. I mean, when I say in line, you're not from that line, right? Lineage, sorry. You're not from that lineage. So you can't aspire. So can we, then maybe we can create something that borrows from liberal democracy and the traditional African system and create something that is sustainable for Africa and that mirrors our values as Africans. Remove that, I very much doubt. The only other thing that can save us is rapid socio-economic development. And the reason for that is simple. When your belly is full of food, you're not thinking about housing, you're not thinking about clothing, you're not thinking about, then you can begin to force or make a fuss about, oh, this government is good, or oh, this government is bad, we should vote it out, those kind of stuff. You know? But for as far as a person is hungry, his immediate concern is food and survival. He doesn't care who provides it, whether the person is wearing a military uniform or a civilian clothes. That is my own view. So until we can accelerate socio-economic development, that is the only thing that can guarantee the institutionalization of democracy in Africa. Once our development is at a certain level, democracy is likely to flourish in this continent. Until then, we just keep trying.
Excellent. I think the African Union also plays a big role there, or should play a big role there. So we have an online question here from Tembani. Tembani, you can please, the floor is yours. You can ask a question. Tembani, can you hear us? You are on mute.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, thanks a lot, Prof, for that presentation. Very insightful one, more especially on this issue, because a lot of people have been dealing with this issue in terms of the analysis that has been forthcoming at a very elementary and rudimentary level. So I think we went deeper, and then and provided us with more insightful insights, on this issue. I think for me, really, based on what we have said, I think you indicated in your presentation that the UN Charter does have a provision that states that the regional economic communities, when they are going to take military in the UN security authorization, and you highlighted that in West Africa, ECOWAS has before intervened without of getting that authorization from the UN Security Council. And for me, really, that talks to, and you also included that, in fact, in each of one of its protocols, ECOWAS does have an empowering provision that empowers it to intervene militarily. So, in fact, without even getting the authorization from the United Nations. And for me, that talks to a lack of harmonization of both regional instruments and international instruments, and that really presents a number of challenges, as we are seeing now. But you also alluded to the issue that ECOWAS intervention, they might raise issues of legality. There might be some concerns around the legality of the action. And for me, really, I think that won't really arise, more especially since ECOWAS is having its own empowering provision. And since UN Security Council has been quiet on this issue, and since before, as you indicated, that in some instances, I'm not sure in Sierra Leone or in Liberia, the United Nations Security Council, in fact, didn't condemn such actions. So I think for me, really, issues of legality won't arise in this case. Otherwise, if they were to arise, then one finger will point back to the United Nations, and then it will really put its legitimacy into question. So I think legalities won't really arise, given the fact that ECOWAS is having its own empowering provisions in terms of its protocols. And then you also raise the issue of like what should be the normative role then of legal scholars in light of these unfolding developments. What is the role of public intellectual? What is the role of a legal scholar when it comes to these issues? And for me, really, I think the role of legal scholars should really be that of problematizing the very concept of democracy, which seems to be the organizing principle of international relations. For me, democracy is very problematic, both at its theoretical and praxis level. It's very problematic, more especially when applied to our African context. I think then it becomes our role, maybe as aspiring some of us legal scholars.
Tembani, we lost you there, but thank you so much for your question and your comments. Thank you so much.
To really problematize democracy, Okay. Okay. Now, let me just stop there. But I think the problem is with democracy. You might need to reimagine a future without democracy because it's very problematic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. And we also have a question online from Alexander. You may proceed, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, dear Professor E. Thank you. You always give a very professional and deep analysis of actual events. So thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, from your presentation, I see that there is no very clear and unequivocal provisions in ECOWAS documents assuring international legality of military intervention. From what I heard and seen, it's rather a matter of interpretation. For example, the deployment of military personnel. It's not the same as coming to a country and killing people, right? So I can't still see the very clear provisions assuring on 100% that ECOWAS intervention would be legal, no doubts. So my question is whether there is a certain international court's decision, especially ECOWAS court, that clarifies that matter. That's my question.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Do you want to reply? There's two more in the chat.
Okay. No, let me just take all the questions and then I'll deal with them.
More questions?
Yes.
Okay. Just one comment. The root causes of these incessant coups should be addressed. I believe the main issue is good governance. As long democratically elected leaders do not fulfill their responsibilities, African countries will always be susceptible to coups. A question from Lesegal. Do you think intervention by invitation is permissible? Since there is no general authorization for pro-democratic intervention under international law, the only possible legal basis for potential ECOWAS military intervention would therefore be an invitation by Niger extended to ECOWAS to use force in Niger. Thank you, Ms. Segal. Then we have a question from Gilbert. ECOWAS has a list of early warning signs meant to detect and curb unrest and insecurity. But they seem to have ignored these completely, concentrating on the interventions. How real is it to want to build a house without actually working on the foundation? Does ECOWAS believe more on the cure than in prevention? I believe this is one of the reasons they are almost woefully failing. Thank you so much, Gilbert. And then two more. Or can I? Yes. Okay, two more. One second last one from Adidale. Is there, some argue that the most effective kind of support for Niger should focus not against the junta, but on democratic governance. Isn't this legitimizing the coup until an election is held? How do we balance a need between military intervention and the promotion of democratic governance without creating a humanitarian crisis then? That's the second last question. And the last one from Damilola. In your opinion, what will be the implication for stability in the Sahel region if the Niger coup stands? What will be the implication of the stability in the Sahel region if the Niger coup stands? Thank you so much for the questions. And I see a one hand from Dorcas, but do you want to take a question?
Yes.
So we have Dr. Munyai, who must come and do closing remarks soon, but if there's anybody wants to ask a question in the audience, please let us know. Please, Dorcas, you have the floor. You are on mute. Yes.
Hello, can you hear?
You can go. Please raise your voice.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Mine. I'm not too sure if I had to categorize it rather as a question or a comment, but it seems to be that if you look at how these coups keep on happening, it's more of they are feeding off from the fact that there are weak democratic institutions within which the countries where these coups are happening. So my concern mainly is on the fact that if at the rate at which they keep happening, then whose responsibility is to ensure that within these countries that this is happening, the strength of the institutions that have to guarantee democracy is steady. I'm not too sure how to put it, but my concern is based on the fact that the strength of these institutions, it keeps getting weakened with each and every coup. So now at the end, are we going to have an Africa that does not have strong democratic institutions simply because somebody feels like they are not satisfied with a certain individual that is in power? Because you look at the fact that it happens now. In the next 2 months, you hear that no, there's another coup. The previous leader is also removed from office. Another 2 months later, you hear that, oh no, there's another coup in the very same country. So now the question is, at which point do we, or rather, who then must ensure that these countries are brought back to order if the very same citizens keep on doing the same thing and the same thing? I'm not too sure if my question is clear.
I'm not sure I heard it too.
Okay, so he's basically asking who should be responsible to stop these coups. If currently there's a coup every second week. We saw Gabon this morning, so just generally. Thank you so much, Dorcas. We appreciate it. And Prof, the floor is yours for the next few minutes. We will also have refreshments outside. So if you want to stay, please do stay.
Okay, let me
continue the conversation afterwards too. Is there someone, so perhaps we're running out of time a bit. We could perhaps continue afterwards. Is that fine, bro? So I think, or what do you want to do? It's up to you.
No, you can take the question, but I'll just respond briefly, if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for
Just make it brief, please.
okay. So I did a mention in Article 22 when discussing the role of ECOWAS, part of which includes peacekeeping. how exposed should it be in attempting to keep peace? Going eye for eye and over blind. But then there should be proportionality between the forces. They cannot be able to have a coup, and that's better to fight it in a civil way. But also the most fundamental part, you also mentioned how the AU has responded its view, but there's this silence of the UN Security Council is justifiable, an injustice, some of the justice ever. Is that silence okay, or is there some sort of element in the room? Should the UN Security Council say something, we have an impact in trying to come to a solution? Of course, already the US has called a coup just a coup. US is one of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. What we say of them, should them now the UNSC have to respond? The United Nations responsibility to protect actually, I believe it's something which probably also reach out. How does the UN also exercise this role from the actual side of its responsibility to protect all human rights? Thank you. I try to be as good as
Thanks. Just have to raise a bit because
Okay,
the online
yes.
community too. Just have to, yeah. Thank you.
My name is Zaha. I just wanted to know, like, you think all of these things that are happening, do you think they are purely coming out of internal issues, or do you think there's any external force kind of triggering these?
Last question from Mr. Siku.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Paul. So I remember from your discussion, you stated about the people in Niger being incited over the coup, if I remember correctly. So then, does this suggest that the people acknowledge the military as the Arab state or government? Is you stated that they're excited about the military coup, and also because they're being excited, right? Does this then say that do they acknowledge them as the legitimate government currently because of their excitement? Because the military has taken power over the people and over the territory of the people.
So you're asking whether the
excitement over the coup.
Yes.
Does this then suggest that the people of Niger have acknowledged the military as the legitimate government?
Okay. Well,
And the last question? Okay. We can always continue afterwards. Prof. E, the floor is yours
thank
now.
you very much.
Okay.
No, but it's great. It's interesting questions. So I'll try to deal with all of them as much as, of course, some I do not have answers for. I want to begin with the one I didn't answer. What is the role of the military in Africa, which I didn't answer previously? And I gave a talk on that at a seminar 3 weeks ago on the role of the military in a transitional justice process. And my argument is basically that a democracy will survive to the extent that the military has accepted to subject itself to civil authority. That if the military does not accept civil authority, then the democratic project is very likely to fail. And that is what we're seeing, not only in Africa, but Latin America and everywhere else, right? As lawyers, the importance of that for us is, in legal theory, is the basis of the law, right? Positivists argue that so long as you can command obedience or compliance, right? What you proclaim is law. So even if a military government, these people who now are in charge in Niger, from a positivist point of view, right, they are legal. Because even though they are compelling compliance by use of force, people obey them. They have the coercion, right, to enforce whatever command that they may give to their followers. So that would be law. It would be legal from it's only from perhaps a more if you like, liberal point of view that we can argue that no, it's compulsion. It is compliance not based on free will, like you will see in an election or an elected government, but based on compulsion, and therefore it is invalid. But between fiction and reality, realists insist that it is those who can compel compliance that actually have a valid basis in law. So what is the role of the military in Africa? It should be that they should protect the country from external invasion. In most, if not all, written constitution, the role of the military is always defined. Safeguard, protect the country from external aggression. In rare cases, help to maintain internal stability or restore internal order. But traditionally, that's the role of the police. But sometimes we find them military being deployed in such cases, but that is the exception and not the rule. So when military intervene, it's unusual. When they come into politics through intervention, through coups, is an anomaly. Well, in terms of harmonization between regional economic communities and both continental legal frameworks and international legal framework, there are valid reasons why that may not be possible across board. In some cases, it is possible regional cooperation in climate change issues and economic issues, but in some cases, especially peace and security is one of those cases where it may be difficult to always be in alignment. And that is why even the UN Security Council regards regional organizations as the first port of call in terms of the maintenance of international peace and security in their own region. So that is justifiable because global governance institutions are quite often far away from the site of conflicts. So to the extent that the African Union and the regional economic communities like ECOWAS, their peace and security architecture are not always converging, remains an ongoing issue that they have not been able to resolve. The reason is because ECOWAS was already way ahead in terms of the evolution of its peace and security architecture before the African Union started enacting its own, adopting its own legal framework. Of course, it had been talking about it, but never really acted on it. But the experience of history pushed ECOWAS to start developing more rapidly from 1993 down to 1999, before the African Union even adopted its constitutive act that provided for such Article 4H, for example. So bringing about alignment remains a challenge, and it has not been resolved. Is there a clear provision? Again, Prof. Alex, my response is that you say it's a question of interpretation. Well, yes and no. Yes, because every law is subject to interpretation. But is it clear? Is there a clear provision? I referred to the mechanism for conflict prevention and Article 25. Yeah. So it says this mechanism, which is adopted, which is the authorization is usually given by the authority of heads of government, heads of state and government of the ECOWAS. Now, the mechanism shall be applied in any of the following circumstances. This mechanism does two things, broadly speaking. One, it provides for ECOMOG, which is the military wing of ECOWAS, right? It also provides for the MSC, the Mediation Security Council of ECOWAS, and it expressly provides for situations in which this particular law or treaty can be triggered. And one of those treaties is what I highlighted as in the event of an overthrow or attempted overthrow of a democratically elected government. There are similar provisions. In fact, if you look at, there is one I referred to, which I didn't, the actual framework that was adopted by ECOWAS before this particular protocol was adopted was more explicit in explaining, or rather giving expression to what ECOWAS had in mind. So my response to that question would be yes, there is Article 25 of the mechanism and the protocol on the mechanism for conflict prevention of ECOWAS, which is a treaty, by the way. Ms. Sego, do you think intervention by invitation is legal? Well, the way I would treat the treaty provision like this Article 25 of the protocol would constitute intervention by invitation. Invitation can be given in a treaty. Consent, if you like, because when you invite, what you're giving is consent. So that consent can be given in a treaty that can be ratified, sort of serve as a pre-commitment kind of treaty that envisages such intervention in the future. So one way of looking at, and this also responds to Professor Alex's question, is one way of looking at this particular protocol is to construe it as a pre-commitment to intervention, in which case all the countries that have ratified this treaty have consented of giving their consent to possible intervention by ECOWAS. So you then may not need a contemporaneous consent, which in this kind of case maybe will be difficult. And I guess that's why it was not provided for in this part in the ECOWAS legal framework, because how is ECOWAS going to tell the Niger junta now to come and consent to intervention? I mean, it will not happen. They won't consent. But that consent can, of course, be seen in the treaty they have ratified. ECOWAS has ignored its early. Yes, Gilbert, I agree with you. It has, this particular protocol is regarded as preventive, it's got provision for preventive deployment. In other words, before the actual intervention, it's possible for ECOWAS to deploy non-police activities, force, non-police force that can go into mediation and ways and non-coercive ways of resolving the conflict. Or in some cases, even alerting ECOWAS to the dangers of what is happening in member countries if preemptive action is not taken. So, but ECOWAS had hardly been effective in implementing its early warning mechanism. Not only ECOWAS, the African Union is the same thing. They got continental early warning systems that they hardly implement or trigger. So I completely agree with that. And the support for Niger should be a transition with this. Okay, what does it legitimize the coup? Yes, Dali, the support for Niger should be directed at, I agree with you, it should be directed at finding a way of reaching transition. ECOWAS has rejected the transitional arrangement proposed by the military regime in Niger. But my guess is that at the end of the day, ECOWAS will still have to come to the negotiation table with the junta because there is no way around it. There's going to be a period of transition. They proposed 3 years transition period. ECOWAS rejected that, but we'll wait and see. So my take is that, yes, I think that's where ECOWAS should direct its attention and all external stakeholders. What will the implications for stability if the coup stands? I think the question should be what the implications would be if there is military intervention. From experience, military intervention is easier said than done. In Liberia, in Sierra Leone, the ECOWAS troops were in Liberia for almost 9 years, if I'm not mistaken. The case in Sierra Leone was different because the military were taken out, right? And in any case, they didn't really have support. The military junta were taken out by ECOMOG troops, and they invited the government of Tejan Kaba to come back. And he came back as the president. So that's a completely different situation here. And I guess going into military intervention where the ECOWAS is divided, they won't have the logistics and the resources to be there for a long time. And when you have backings from Burkina Faso, a member of ECOWAS, Mali, a member of ECOWAS, saying they will support the junta, there will probably be a really bloody war if there is intervention. If the coup stands, there will be no stability issue. Why do I think so? Because the coup in Mali stood, the coup in Burkina Faso stood, the coup in Guinea stood. There's been those countries, there's been no general instability. The problem is when there is an intervention and there is resistance, then you have a full-blown civil war, as we had in Liberia. Who should be responsible for stopping coups in Africa? Well, I think the military would be responsible for stopping coups. The reason I say that is because of all the military coups that had happened in West Africa, if I'm not mistaken, since maybe in the last 10 years or so, at least I can say from 2012, when Captain Sanogo of Mali staged a coup, not this particular coup that brought this current junta into power. Now, almost all the leaders, including Major General Tiani of Niger, all of them were trained in the US. The leaders of all these coups, at least I think about 11 of them, of the coups that have been happening in these different West African countries, have been led by people, military officers who were sent to the US for training. What was the purpose of the training? The purpose was to professionalize the army, right? Train them in a way that they accept their constitutional responsibility to protect the country, accept civil authority, accept an elected civilian president as your commander-in-chief. But if you look at the records, they've all done the opposite. So I say the military because if they decide, even in so-called secure democracies, if the military decide to overthrow the government, the worst that can happen would be there will be a civil war, unless there's a counter coup. If there's no counter coup, they overthrow the government, it's a done deal. But if the people rise up and say, no, this coup will not stand, then you can have a civil war, in which case the outcome can be either way, 50-50. The military can continue and remain in power, or if they crush the rebellion or the civil disobedience, then but if the civil disobedience is able to overthrow the military regime, then they can institute a civilian government. Otherwise, the military is supposed to defend democracy, but if they choose not to, it's a difficult situation to deal with. I'm happy, so should we be inattentive to keep the peace? Mahamba, the UN Security Council silence, okay. Well, I think there is a reason for why this Niger experience is being kept out of the Security Council. My take is that if this matter goes to the Security Council and a vote for maybe an action to be taken on is going to be difficult because the Security Council will be divided. So perhaps that explains why France has not pushed the matter into the Security Council. So just quickly, what is responsible for the coup, internal or external actors? A combination of both. Internal factors and internal actors, right? And external actors. In fact, the coup in Niger was initially explained as one instance of Russian malign activity, right? To instigate conflict in French sphere of influence, right? But I think that's a rather simplistic explanation. The reason I say so is because the situation in these countries is desperate. The economic situation is desperate. So these are internal factors. The external factors may exacerbate such internal factors, right? The extent to which the fact that the demonstrators are waving Russian flag and holding pictures of Vladimir Putin, it may indicate, well, no, we want a new alliance with a new external partner. So the French must get out. Was that responsible for the coup? Well, only time will tell. It may be, it may not be, but my guess is that if these people really wanted Mohamed Bazoum, the elected president, to continue, we would not see them jubilating in the street. My response to those who raise that kind of argument is that, no, these are rented crowd. It's the junta that mobilized them, that hired them to come and say, no, that's a simplistic argument because the response to the coup was spontaneous, okay? Which showed, or at least demonstrates some level of frustration with the current Bazoum government for whatever reason, right? So that they now see the coupist as a savior tells you something about the government of Bazoum. I think that was the okay. Does the excitement annul the Bazoum election? Really, does the excitement celebration validate or legitimize the junta, thereby annulling the Bazoum election? I think that's a good question for jurisprudence. Okay, well, yes, I wouldn't say it does, but if you go with the argument that the expression of popular will legitimizes the basis of authority of a government, you would say, yes, it annuls the Bazoum government and legitimizes the coup, the military junta's regime. Okay, because this will not be the first time we will see it. And the popular uprising in Libya, we will say it delegitimized Gaddafi's regime, right? And legitimized the opposition government, so to speak. It's the same people carrying placards, jumping in the street. That was the criteria we used, okay? If we take the same criteria and apply it to Niger, you will say the coup, the military regime is a legitimate government. But that's my take.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof. We have Dr. Munya just to close proceedings. You want to sit there?
Thank you so much, Prof, for the presentation. We really appreciate it. It was quite informative. I think we all agree that it's really unfortunate that, you know, the rise of coups occur or try to emphasize on the importance of independence. And really prompts us to really question the essence of democracy. What is democracy in the African context? And I guess to some extent, the increasing rate of coups, as prompted by one of the participants, requires us truly to reflect, and African leaders as well, to reflect on the essence of democracy and what democracy means for African society. So thank you so much for highlighting that. Thank you as well for also highlighting one of the root causes, which is social economic issues as well. That is very profound and very important, and it clearly shows that that is a root cause that interlinks with all other issues that African societies face. So truly there is a responsibility for African leaders to take this into account. And I guess to some extent, it's also our responsibility as well, as scholars and as Africans in general, in trying to make sure, or in trying to question our role, and how we can, what is our role to ensure that whatever shape or form the democracy that we want, at the end of the day, it must be sustainable and not just abstract. So thank you so much, Prof, and thank you so much to our participants online, in person as well. And as mentioned earlier, for those who are here on campus, there are a few invites to excite your talents. So thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yes, we are done. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Just from
Stop here or something.